Thank you. Thank you, Martha. In one of the sessions earlier, Dr. Misha Porter described what we're in right now as a moment of opportunity. And this conversation is really going to kind of double down on what does that mean for us, especially in city government. And I think it's really important to lay some context that New York City has more history with algorithmic accountability than almost any city in the country, right? Over a decade ago, the city launched one of the first automated decision-making task forces. In 2017, you passed Local Law 49 to study how the city uses algorithms. And in 2021, the city passed the Automated Employment Decision Tool Law, which requires bias audits for any tool that is making hiring decisions in the city. In 2023, something we'll talk a lot about in this panel today, the Office of Technology and Innovation published one of the first of its kind action plans that laid out how city agencies could responsibly adopt AI. And then, just at the end of last year, New York City enacted the GUARD Act. This is a set of laws that's designed to make the city's use of AI and automated decision-making more transparent and more accountable. It created the Office of Algorithmic Accountability, which oversees the ways that agencies procure and use public impacting AI, and overall are meant to move the city toward a more formal review process with public visibility and really clear guardrails for future government AI use. And now, with the new administration, the city has a new CTO and a new mandate, and there's a chance to ask, how should the Mamdani administration approach AI, and what are the opportunities to improve service delivery and continue the city's role as a leader in AI governance? And today, to answer some of those questions, we're really lucky to be in conversation with three current and former civil servants, experts, and lovely humans. On the panel today, we have Alex Ford, Assistant Commissioner for Research and Collaboration at New York City's Office of Technology and Innovation, where he's been at the center of the city's AI governance work for years, including serving as the city's original, I'm going to get this right, Algorithms Management and Policy Officer, and led the development of New York City's 2023 AI Action Plan. Alex is one of the people who has built the infrastructure that the new administration is inheriting. Alex, welcome. We also have Tayyab Walker, Associate Commissioner for Data Engineering and Governance at New York City's Office of Technology and Innovation, where he's leading the city's data infrastructure and analytics work. Most recently, Tayyab was part of the team behind Benefits Engine, the city's first cross-agency personalized benefits recommendation system to go into the MyCity portal. Tayyab, welcome. And last, but certainly not least, we have Ariel Kennan, Senior Director at the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown, where she researches and advises on design, data, and technology for the equitable delivery of public benefits. Before Georgetown, Ariel founded the nation's first municipal service design studio at the New York City Mayor's Office of Economic Opportunity. Yes. So Ariel brings practitioner roots, a researcher lens, and the firsthand experience in city government to this conversation as well. Ariel, welcome. Hi, everybody. I'm Genevieve Godet. I'm director of Nava Labs at Nava PBC, where we study the ways that emerging tools, technologies, and practices can benefit public services and advocate for their adoption into agencies. I had the great fortune of working at that service design studio with Ariel and Tayyab, and I will be your moderator today. So I would love for the folks in the panel to set some context about where are we really starting from. And Alex, I was hoping you could go first. As OTI has completed most of the 37 actions laid out in the 2023 plan, what groundwork is actually there, and what can the new administration build on now?
Yep, great, thanks. Well, just for starters, I want to thank everyone for being here today, for Beta NYC for hosting us and having this panel, and my co-panelists for joining us with this. I think it really is important that we touched on some of the history in your introduction, because we've actually been at this for quite some time, for upwards of 7-8 years, sort of depending on where you start measuring, and what sort of vocabulary you think is relevant for this conversation. But to give just a little bit more context, we started this work in 2018-ish or so with the Automated Decision Systems Task Force, which then evolved into this role of algorithms management and policy within the mayor's office at the end of the de Blasio administration. And then when the Adams administration began in 2022, the focus was on the creation of OTI as this sort of centralized technology office for the city. And that was sort of a new inflection point for us to think about the next stage of the work that we were doing around AI. At the end of 2021, the city had published a document called the New York City AI Strategy, which was a sort of precursor to the action plan, which laid out a lot of the sort of research and planning baseline to help the sort of general public and the city understand, what is AI even, because that was a pretty sort of important touch point at that point in time. And then to also start to say, okay, well, why will this matter? That 2021 sort of changed to 2022 and 2023 gave us the opportunity to not just focus on sort of the baseline information, but more strategically thinking about what can we actually do. And that was the genesis of the action plan. The action plan was intended, as you can tell by the name, action, to be oriented around things that the city could actually do to move forward work that was intended to help balance responsible use and innovation. And that's sort of like the core of the document is, we want to be able to sort of say, AI has a lot of opportunities, the city's been using AI for decades, so it already has sort of shown its ability to support city agencies in their work. But we're acknowledging the fact that there's a special set of considerations for those technologies that fall under that umbrella of AI that warrant extra sort of care and attention. So the action plan was designed to be able to speak to both of those parameters and then lay out very concrete actions. That was published in 2023, and as you said, we're nearly done. 35 out of 37 actions have actually been addressed, but it was always intended to be the jumping off point for more. So the action plan in and of itself is sort of a springboard to say, okay, now that we've sort of articulated what the specific things that we as a city need to do, and then sort of built out the early infrastructure for that, then we need to keep doing that. So rather than thinking about things as a one-off, one initiative to be met, one sort of box to check. It's more about now how we sort of institutionalize and routinize the things that we're doing across the board. So the action plan covers a couple of different areas of focus, governance, support for the city's workforce, support for procurement efforts, and all of the work that we've done from the actions of the action plan have been to say, okay, what sort of programming, what sort of initiatives can we support going forward, and then how do we keep current, and how do we make sure that these sorts of efforts are continuing in the longer run. So there's a lot that we've been doing on that front. And now as we move into, what year are we in? 2026, we are sort of saying, okay, this is now going to be part of the way that the city does business. And our focus now is less on sort of these new initiatives and more the next steps, right? All of the follow-up from everything that we did.
Yeah, thank you for that. And when we're thinking about the ways that we deliver services kind of on those front lines, Tayyab, your work on the benefits engine is one of, I think, one of those very public-facing efforts, also AI adjacent. And I'm curious what you learned from that project about the conditions that really make that cross-agency data work happen effectively.
Sure. So let me start off first with a little bit contextualization about when we talk about the benefits engine. So the benefits engine is a service that we implemented back in November 2024 through the city's digitized childcare application. The benefits engine is premised on following, a few premises, built based on a few premises. Number one, that agencies, particularly human service agencies, connect thousands of households to benefits every year, or programs that they administer every year. And they do that quite often. A lot of those programs require that residents fill out applications. A lot of those applications tend to collect the same types of information, particularly if it's a means-tested program like household composition, income, expenses, assets, and whatnot. And however, most agencies really don't have the capacity or infrastructure as families are coming in and applying to screen those families or tell them about other services that are outside of their jurisdiction or outside their administration. The idea of the benefits engine is takes, and builds upon work that New York City has been doing for over 20 years or about 20 years. 20 years now. Another anniversary here. Particularly with, if you're familiar with the Access NYC, but the city's public-facing screener. Everybody can go online, Access NYC, and screen themselves by putting that type of information I just named anonymously, and get a readout of up to 40 federal, city, state programs that they may be eligible for, okay? So the benefits engine is saying, well, we have this, and through the work of folks on this stage, that was a API was created several years ago. So why not, if administrative data is going through applications like this, why not connect that API to an application when we have the opportunity to do that? And screen persons, regardless of what they're applying for, screen them at the moment of entry for other programs. And so that is the concept behind the benefits engine. You asked what we learned through data sharing. I'm actually going to flip that, because I've been in this too long. I would say actually what I have learned about data sharing that I brought to bear on that project, and that I think is also relevant for the conversation today. Number one, when it comes to kind of data sharing, and particularly when we're talking about resident information dealing with people, and all of the kind of be it privacy or regulatory kind of constraints around it. You have to think about three things when you're talking about or considering data sharing projects. One, you have a compelling use case. And that compelling use case where we start is, how does this improve the lives of New Yorkers? So if we want to bring data together, if we want to do something with data that belongs to people that they are entrusting us with, how does that proposition improve their life? The second one is, what about privacy? And so in this case, how are we going to protect that? Obviously, to move data across, there is, the concept of disclosure. But there are also ways to kind of think about what actually really needs to be disclosed to make this project happen. And I think a lot of times data sharing projects, and going into the benefits engine, you kind of start trying to peel off a lot of stuff where they're kind of honing in on what you really need. And the wonderful thing about that is there were two things that helped us move this project along. One, the Access NYC screener always utilized anonymized data. And so in this case, we could leverage that. Second, because people are now filling out an application, they're putting information about themselves, and they're through the child care application, we can also say, hey, can we have your consent to do this, and remove it from a dark pattern. In other words, if you're applying for child care, we will not force you to opt into the service as a condition of your child care eligibility. It is optional, it has no effect, and we make that very clear. And then the final one for data sharing is, and I think for AI governance too, as we kind of move forward, is what is, because we're talking about typically brokering information across one or more agencies, and agencies in fulfillment of their mission to better the lives of New Yorkers. The big question is, if we're going to share information with one another, how does what you were asking me to do as an agency to share or bring you into the world of my clients, how does that improve, or how does that benefit my clients? And so I say that these may sound like three kind of very simple things, but it took me a very long time to kind of make that sort of a premise of every sort of data sharing proposition. And that, I think, helped us kind of, one, set the tone for the benefits engine, help it bring it into kind of a safe implementation, and move forward with it. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Ariel, I'm curious, from your position at the Beck Center and having such kind of deep knowledge of the ways that New York City thinks about designing and delivering these services, how do you see the efforts in the context of other city governments, even around the world, and what do you think the new administration can be building now?
Yeah, thank you all for having me here today, and thank you to Beta NYC for hosting. I think looking more nationally and, oftentimes, especially when we're thinking about things like benefits, New York City has a lot more in common actually with states than other cities because we uniquely administer programs like SNAP and Medicaid. I work a lot with states on benefits delivery in my work at Georgetown. And, I think we're seeing some really promising efforts where, sandboxes are being created, safe environments away from production systems, the same way we wouldn't, deploy other software code into production without thorough testing. Our AI systems also need to be in spaces where they're safe and secure and not touching things like PII, et cetera, as appropriately. I think doing some really great training, one on kind of overall best practices, safety, et cetera, but also on using these, it's a new tool. It works in ways that our other technologies do not work. And there's so much opportunity space. And so really helping empower public servants with the skills to be able to use AI in their work, think creatively. I think it's a huge opportunity for a lot of the technology capacity building that many of us have been trying to do for a long time inside government, either from inside or outside. And really an opportunity also to continue to empower public servants to be great stewards of technology, but also great buyers of technology. And I think that's a really important thing that the administration in New York can continue to be doing even better at. There's been some fun stuff coming out of other cities, and I think city competition is like really good and healthy. There's a really cool civic analytics package that came out this week that's Boston, Pittsburgh, and San Jose, where they're actually using Claude skills on top of their open data sets so that you can actually pull in structured data into policy analysis. And they have like a set of kind of standard policy things you might run using that data. It's super smart. It's the kind of thing where you're like, man, New York should be doing that. There's been some of that work happening from the outside. But I think that I would love to see the city really playing the leading role in that type of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we think about, the themes that I've even just heard from these initial kind of context setting questions, and a theme certainly Mayor Mamdani has shared a lot about, is that AI should be a lever for equity in addition to efficiency. And I think it's important to acknowledge that New Yorkers have had some pretty visible poor experiences, like with the MyChat, giving wrong information or systems that might feel opaque. And so I'm curious for folks, maybe we can start with Alex, to answer, how does the city build or rebuild public trust in AI-assisted services, and should that be the goal?
To answer the second question first, yes. Public engagement is a critical part of the use of technology in government generally, and then obviously has, as we talked about, sort of special implications for AI, given the way that AI works or the types of data or the volume of data sometimes that are being used for systems. So the general sort of position that we have is that public engagement is obviously going to be very context specific and unique, right? So the sort of engagement that one agency, if it's a human services agency, needs to do is going to look incredibly different than if you're an infrastructure agency. Your geographies may be different, your direct impact on individuals may be different or further removed. So we don't want to be overly prescriptive about what public engagement processes are, because there could be quite a wealth or sort of like a menu of options that are available. But certainly the idea of public engagement is a sort of a centerpiece of a lot of the work that we're doing. We built out a whole chapter in the action plan around public engagement, and have done some of our initial efforts to be able to actually meet the public directly and talk about the city's use of AI. We did a session last summer with the Queens Public Library, a couple of different branches, where we went and talked about some of the public reporting that we do. And actually some of that feedback made its way into changes that we made for the 2025 reporting based on what we had heard directly from the public. And I think to the other part of your question, trust comes from the public's ability to understand how and why, essentially. So that's why the city is, I think, a leader in putting out public information about the way that it uses AI. We've been publishing a directory of algorithmic tools, which is the term of art that we use here in the city, for 6 years. We just published our 2025 report yesterday, so that's now available on nyc.gov/AI, so you can find it there. Like I said, we've been doing this for 6 years. We have, as far as we can tell, the only municipal level AI directory in the country. Not many examples elsewhere at the state or federal level. Well, there is one federal, but it's the federal government; they can do it. And so the point there of transparency is that that's where you start with making sure that people understand, again, the how and the why. And it goes a long way to be able to communicate out to the public and say, here's what you can see, right? Like you can see some tools that are about risk prediction. You can see other tools that are about, genetic modeling for the health department, right? Like there's a huge diversity and breadth of use cases that you can see. And I think when you look at that, it helps to create a clearer picture. And that helps to then sort of drive closer communication between the public and government. So that combination of transparency and the ability to have information out there, as well as more proactive engagement, is what we need to be able to make sure that there's that sort of continued feeling of trust.
That makes sense. Ty, I'm curious for your take on that.
Sure. So I'm going to plus on everything Alex said, but I'm going to contextualize it from sort of the spirit of this week. And one, should it be a goal? Yes. Two, how should we go about doing it? I think you don't have to look much farther than what's happening in this room to kind of consider a model for how we build engagement around work that government is doing. Think about where open data and open data initiatives started years and years ago. It wasn't, I think probably the first data sets were, how many windows, how many windows are in my building, and look at where we are today. And so when we talk about engagement, I think, we need to kind of, from a government point of view, really think about what engagement means, that, providing information is one step. Providing it in a kind of digestible way and understandable way, and then kind of talking with the public to make sure that conversation, and there's a fluency with what we hope is transparency is critical. So I'm going to leave it at that. I think, we, through the open data, we can look, what we've done here as kind of a correlate. Many differences, but a correlate for how engagement happens and the potential and possibilities that when you do it and do it right.
Yeah, I think one thing I share with a lot of state leaders and government leaders who are AI curious is that AI is here, whether you like it or not. You might not be putting it on, nyc.gov in an application just yet for whatever purpose, but members of the public are using the commercial models, whether it's Gemini, which is just baked into Google searches now, or using Claude or using ChatGPT to ask questions about government services. And one really great way to erode trust is when they get bad or inaccurate or incomplete information in that query. And so I think it's a huge responsibility, and a great way to build trust is for governments to really think about how their information, their data can be structured and shared, and even work directly with the commercial models. A lot of them have been building teams that are working on specific domains. And so thinking not only about serving up information, but doing tasks within those domains that are more specialized. And I think that's just, another really great way we can help improve trustworthiness in our services.
That makes sense. Alex, I want to ask you about the tension between that accountability and wanting to be move, be operationally agile, and be delivering these services to staff and to city staff, or to New Yorkers and to city staff. Can you talk a little bit about that tension and how you see that getting resolved in the new administration?
Sure. I think tension is sometimes the right word, but sometimes we also would prefer to think of it more sort of as equilibrium, because I think both of those components are necessary, right? You have to be innovative and you have to be forward-thinking and creative in terms of coming up with solutions to difficult problems, right? That's what our agencies are tasked to do. They have missions that they have been, explicitly instructed to deliver with finite resources. So we never want to get in the way of creative thinking and creative problem solving. We don't want to swing in the opposite direction, though, where we're only thinking about the advantages and not thinking about risk or challenges or the management of those. And our goal all along, and I'll admit it's a dynamic one, right? Like we're constantly trying to find that equilibrium point. It's not like you find it once and then you just stay there, but is to sort of say we want to be able to innovate, but we also want to make sure that we're managing and governing. What we've worked on so far specifically to AI has largely focused on the ability to provide agencies with best practices and the guidance that they need to approach a lot of this problem solving in a bit more of a thoughtful way from the outset. So we published we just reissued a new version in December, but we have a principles and definitions document that's available to agencies and public that helps agencies to sort of ground their projects in a shared vocabulary for the city. So we've created a singular definition for AI, and then sort of dozens of other terms so that all of the city can sort of like think about these things with the same vocabulary. And then the principles that we've laid out are intended to then underpin not only individual agency work, but some of the additional guidance that we've published. So we've laid out 5 principles: information security, privacy, validity and reliability, trust and transparency, and social responsibility. And then we've built additional guidance, for example, for generative AI, that then builds on top of those principles. So it's sort of this like layered process. I think it's also important to acknowledge that agency technology projects have lots of different reviews and different sort of pathways that they need to go through that may be unrelated to AI that already exist, around cybersecurity, around information privacy, contracting, so all of those factors are still there, and we do consider those to be part of an effective governance structure. And so on that front, we're looking to see how we can make sure that those existing frameworks have the sort of breadth to be able to cover some of the novel issues that are coming up for AI systems. And if it feels like there's a gap, how can we work with the owners of those frameworks to help close those gaps?
Yeah, thank you for that. Ariel, I wanna make some space to talk about what I know has been a sort of a core pillar in your work over many years, which is benefits modernization. So you've done, work on policy to code with the Beck Center and AI-assisted rules translation. And I'm curious if you see opportunities to bring in some of those emerging tools and applications to the work to serve New Yorkers and what that really looks like in your mind.
Absolutely, yes. Lots of opportunity here. And, something I try to share when I talk about rules as code or policy to code is thinking about how the logic in policy ends up written in software code and the translation that happens between that legal language into a computer language that can then be executed in software. We were doing this work in New York City, and there's several people in the room that continue to do this work in New York City. There wasn't a language to talk about it, a terminology, or actually an international community around rules as code that now exists. And one thing that surprised me when I got to Georgetown 5 years ago and started looking into this more and kind of discovered it is that no one was talking about it in the US, which really seemed like, wow, we shouldn't be behind Australia, New Zealand, and France in how we're building our government software and technology. But New York City has actually been a leader in this. And Ty had mentioned Access NYC actually launched in 2006. That is the same year that Gmail launched. And so just to think, how far ahead some of our government leaders were thinking 20 years ago about how we could use the internet to help connect people to services. When we were in the mayor's office, we worked to rebuild Access NYC, design it in a way that was more privacy preserving, actually allowed for more openness and better usage, and actually got people through the screener, really designed like hand in hand with New Yorkers and those who help serve them and access benefits. And then one of our other missions was opening up those rules and through the API that then became part of the benefits engine. New York City remains the only government in the entire United States that has open benefits eligibility rules. it's a huge thing. And I every time I talk about it publicly, I'm like, please, someone tell me that I'm wrong about that, because I would really love to see another government be in that place. But the status quo is actually that all of the enrollment systems are still closed. There is no transparency in them. So from a kind of good governance and open government perspective, not great that we are asking people to share very sensitive information. We run it against a set of rules. We don't actually know if those rules are right. It tends to come up when there's like a massive amount of people who are being kicked off benefits or not getting enrolled in benefits who should likely be eligible. Advocates take notice of it. It becomes a bigger thing, and then states are forced to make changes. In a different world, we could have more open rules where there's just more transparency, and then really allows the ability to more people can create applications on top of them, cross benefits and cross agency work can happen more easily, et cetera. So I've been writing about for quite a few years now that we should have an open standard around the rules. We should have states and cities adopting that and publishing their rules and like approving software code that is a version of their legal policy. There's been some great efforts on it, but one of the things that always kept being a blocker on it was there's not enough people hours to do that rules translation. But guess what? AI is really good at doing that translation. But we had to test it out. So us and some other organizations have been doing open documentation where we're publishing everything from the actual prompts that we put in, what we get back, the rubrics that we use to actually evaluate it and show what's possible. And so I think there's a huge opportunity space around this. It also means, to my earlier point about having structured data and information that AI can then consume. If you're putting rules out as software code, it's even easier for AI to take that in and understand it. I work on the benefits space, so I write about it in the benefits space, but highly applicable across all rules. So thinking about zoning, housing, in health inspections, just tons of potential for it. One of the kind of fun things we've seen at a more of a national scale is the President Biden's executive order on cybersecurity included rules as code for cyber policy so that you could be using that to validate that you're actually following the policy. Has not been implemented yet, but fingers crossed that part of the executive order was not repealed by the Trump administration. So hopefully some potential for that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I kind of want to flip to the other side of that front line, right? We have New Yorkers accessing services, and then there are the frontline staff who are the face, the front door, the way that many people access and interact with their government. And one of the questions on my mind is whether, how, or if AI might help some of those frontline workers better support and deliver services to the city, while at the same time, many in and out of city government have real concerns about job displacement, about training and readiness. How do you think about acknowledging those concerns while also designing for the benefit of city staff and for New Yorkers? And maybe Tayyab, you can go first, but I'd love for everybody to share their point of view.
So one, I think first acknowledge it, as you said, kind of acknowledge that is a concern. And I will just talk from inside government, although there are people who are doing, my colleagues are doing more work around this specifically with caseworkers. I know of a few kind of really kind of exciting projects, and I like the word that you use, safe, because I say like, as long as these are kind of in AI safe zones, i.e. they are projects or uses or potential implementation of AI that really kind of complement sort of the work and do have a value proposition to a caseworker or a frontline worker that does something in regards to kind of saving time or helping out without kind of coming in the middle of an important sort of case management decision. Having said that, I think it is incumbent upon us to think about agency. Human agency in the middle of this. A lot of what I hear in a lot of these projects oftentimes, and I've even kind of ideated a few things and said, we've got to have caseworkers or people actually at the decision point. But I also think about too sort of, sometimes, bureaucratic cultures. and I think sort of the reality of bureaucratic cultures over years kind of tend to be around rulemaking and rule following. How well, can you issue rules, and how well can you all follow them? Rather than sort of decision making and discretion. And there reasoning behind that. But now you bring in sort of a tool here that's unlike, sort of, one-sided or, not sort of generating ideas. How do we make sure that within that kind of context and culture that, a caseworker who is likely under a lot of pressure already to do a lot of things, that tool is relieving pressure, and that caseworker can look at these AI implementation as a tool versus a rule, and I think, that's something, I think we have to just kind of both acknowledge and bring to the fore caseworkers, but also, it's as we think about, how these things get implemented, I think we have to be, provide some caution around that. Otherwise, it not only, I think, kind of begins to sort of erode some of that trust in AI or enforce some of these kind of concerns of AI taking over. But I think it, Ari, I'm going to point back to you again. You talk about these we need more people. We need more people in terms of AI, I think for workers and for residents and for people in general, it is very easy for kind of an AI proposition where we become consumers of AI, assets, i.e. our data, our use of AI, versus producers and owners in the process. And I think that starts here with these SAFE projects.
Yeah. Alex, how does that show up on the research and collaboration team for you?
Yeah, so very interestingly, we were drafting the action plan in 2023 before ChatGPT became public, and we had drafted a whole chapter on workforce support with the intent that the city was going to need a set of initiatives to support the city's workforce in working, that we sort of use the two preposition phrasing, with and then on AI. So on meaning, you're a technical person who's developing, building, et cetera, with meaning you're some sort of, business user who's using a tool as part of your job. And then we published, and then ChatGPT came out at roughly the same time, and we're glad we wrote that chapter because this is really going to change the way that we're thinking about some of this workforce support. One of the first things that we did, we issued a survey to our agencies and then sort of said, let's get a baseline of where you think the skills needs are within your agency. And the top skill across not every single agency, but across the board was AI literacy. So far above, development skills or anything that you would kind of put in more of the hard skills bucket was just general literacy. So we said, okay, that is where we're going to start first. And the idea here was, the prevalence of these tools, the sort of role that AI is taking in the national conversation, where people talk about it outside of work, which they didn't used to do, means that we have a lot to get caught up on, because just because people are talking about it doesn't mean they actually know what it is or how it works or what impacts it has. So we've been focusing mostly on how we can sort of raise that floor within the city's workforce. Obviously, over time, we'll need to focus on specialization, right? Different segments of the city's workforce are going to need different skills to keep up, to be able to sort of, address the role that AI can play in their day-to-day. But we think that we have sort of a minimum standard here that we need to be thinking about when it comes to how agency staff are thinking about these things. So we published a speaker series, an educational course that's available to every single city employee that they can take on the city's central learning management platform, that started with a What is AI course that we self-produced. And then we're supplementing that with additional outside speakers and other training resources to get that in the hands of city staff. I think the general sentiment that we are sort of quite firm on is that we are thinking about the sort of role that AI plays with city staff, not instead of, and thinking about what our city staff need to be able to interact effectively with those tools.
Yeah. Ariel, you've been an advocate for designing with and not for as long as I've known you. And I'm curious if you can share how you think about threading that balance between real concerns about AI and also designing for the benefit of frontline workers.
Yeah, I think that often when we're talking about some of the workforce stuff, we're pretending like things are working well right now. And sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. I think a real notable example here in the city was the extensive SNAP backlog. The city has resolved. There's a federal mandate that SNAP applications are to be processed in 30 days. And New Yorkers were waiting 6 months or more to get that service. And when you were waiting to get food on your table to feed your kids, that's not an excusable delay. The city was sued for that, and there was a settlement around it. But a lot of it was actually a staffing issue. And there's a wonderful report that council put out last year that it further investigated this, which looks at both the staffing and the technology barriers to this. But part of it was that there were not enough people to process those SNAP applications. And the time it takes on each application is so high, which all of that creates the backlog. And so I think really thinking about these tools of, one, the rules that govern these programs are immense. I've never seen the New York City or state rules printed out, but our friends at Sevilla, which is a design nonprofit in Detroit, they have the Michigan Integrated Services rules printed out, and it's a binder that's about, I think it's like 18 inches tall if you print all of the rules. And you as a caseworker are expected to be able to follow all of those rules as you adjudicate a case. That's really hard to do, and normal semantic search does not do well in that set of rules. And so I'm actually going to give Genevieve a shout out because she has been doing some incredible work helping case managers be able to use AI to get through these really complex policies and be able to use them to better serve the people who they're trying to enroll. And I think both look at kind of opportunity space of where can we maybe enroll people and have opportunities in some of the gray areas of the rules that help with that enrollment, or also things that might end up as a penalty. That's one of the other things that's happening in benefits right now is states are being penalized around error rates. It's quite a big threat to the programs, and so an even bigger focus on accuracy and who makes the decisions, on a case getting approved or not is that caseworker. So really trying to give them the tools. I think Genevieve and her team at NAVA have been doing a great job of really working hand in hand and using tools where you get to actually score the prompts and then give feedback the responses, give the prompts, score the responses on, how complete, how accurate they are, and if they're actually helping you. So I'm optimistic that we can continue to put technology in people's hands as a tool, and then also be using technology where people don't need to be doing that, or it's things that computers are good at that humans might be less good at, and really empowering our humans to be helping other humans for service delivery.
Yeah, thank you for that. There are some folks out in the audience who I know are working on those things right now, and we're lucky to have the School of Data audience with us today. In the crowd, we've got researchers, advocates, technologists, civil servants. I'm curious, maybe we can start with you, Alex. What do you all think is the most useful thing that people in this room can be doing to shape how AI lands in city government over the next 4 years?
It'd be hard to pinpoint just one. I think because as you said, there's a lot of different profiles that we have in the room. I think one thing that seems common sense, but we sometimes forget to talk about is just understanding the state of the art of the technology, which is often driven by large companies, yes, but also individual researchers, academic institutions, and being able to sort of stay fresh on what the state of the art is, particularly thinking about where generative AI's, I'll call it, weaknesses when it was sort of first coming out. We're sort of just putting a little bit of a damper on the enthusiasm, right? Oh, wow, this is great. Oh, wow, it's messing up. And a lot of work has been done in a very short period of time to really sort of address some of these problems. And so I think driving innovative solutions and keeping the city informed on what the state of the art is actually very critical. And then from the more of resident perspective, right, all of us as residents of New York City, I think this sort of idea of engagement is something that we have started on and welcome a sort of a greater participation and an effort on our part, of course, to reach people, but understanding what individual residents' concerns may be is actually really crucial. It's obviously a huge city. It's, 45 to 75 agencies, depending on how you define the term agency, all with different missions. And so it can be a little hard to sort of know exactly where the concerns are without a little bit more direct feedback. It's on us to create the forums for that, and so that's our commitment. But I think what we want to be able to know is what are people's interests in? Where are they wanting to learn more? Where are they wanting to get more involved so that we can help sort of bridge those gaps?
Yeah. Taya, what do you think? What should people be focusing on?
Data governance.
Yeah.
I mean, AI governance is data governance. I mean, AI is data, and we talk about often, sort of the kind of need for, the quality of that data. When we get into it, the more hidden things around sort of how data was collected, what biases exist in it, and whatnot. So I'm going to beat the drum of data governance, and I'm also going to say that just like. To me, I have for years before we even started talking more presently about AI. It had always given me great angst that you walk in a room and everybody I can ask how many people here think data governance is important. Everybody's going to raise their hand. How many people are working on data governance in their agency? And then it's crickets. And I look and I kind of look at that as a correlate to AI, and I say we've got to kind of beat that drum because it's these fundamentals. There's so much promise, and every time I see and hear, and like I said, I know of projects where what Ariel is talking about, I think we can make some really great strides in the city of New York around these areas that kind of befuddle us and kind of constrain us, and then therefore make it harder for us to kind of deliver service to New Yorkers. But at the same time, we've got to hold to those fundamentals. And so I'm going to keep beating that drum. It may not be the most interesting drum, but I'm going to keep beating that. And I think even within this room, there is likely a number of folks, if we polled, who are very enthusiastic about this. There's likely some folks in this room who may have some skepticism. And then there are likely folks who are virulently sort of anti and opposed to this. And if anything that, I think this civic tech community does well is it engages in this conversation in a respectful way. And I think, we need to surface this conversation, particularly when it comes to AI, and think about it. It's very easy for us to give lip service to guardrails. It's a lot harder to kind of define and implement them. And so these are things, I think, in the long run, continue to serve not only our mission around AI, but what we can do for New Yorkers universally at all.
Vibe coding prototypes. I've spent my entire career as a designer and technologist and have learned all the specialized tools, whether it was Photoshop or Figma or any of the other ones that have been around over the years. And AI is now, you're able to prompt a prototype now. And I think that is just an incredible unlock of you as a civic technologist or any New Yorker or a public servant can now say, I have an idea. I can make that idea real. So, and have a demo instead of a memo is one of the civic tech aphorisms, and be able to start showing that idea. Is that production ready code? Is it ready to scale in the enterprise? Absolutely not. But I think it makes just the notion of prototyping a lot less precious, and that we can really be trying stuff out much more quickly, getting it in the hands of real people and real users, and continuing with what's actually working and quickly throwing away things that are less relevant. I had been a little skeptical of some of this stuff. And then actually last summer, some of my students at Georgetown in our rules as code work, they prompted everything from the rules generation to actually the entire front end screener. All the questions perfect? Is it the most beautiful web interface you've ever seen? No. But I look at how much time we spent on like rebuilding Access NYC, and they did it in a series of prompts, which means then you can actually focus on the other details instead of like getting all the pixels just right. And that I think it's a huge unlock for the possibilities.
Agreed. We have about 5 minutes to take maybe a question or two, and then we'll bring it back and kind of wrap it up, if that's all right with everyone. Are there any questions? Yeah, maybe here in the front. Thank you guys so much. You have a little button for your mic. It says speak.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you guys so much for the panel. I had a question for Alex and Tayab about what OTI can do to unblock city agencies. I think it's great that like the AI action plan and like AI literacy has all been pushed, but I personally feel like at the actual ground level within city agencies, we aren't able to even like install a programming language on our workstations, so we aren't really able to be unblocked to use AI tools the way like they've seen revolutionary changes in private sector. Like it's taking like hours to build things that took like 6 months. And we really need to improve our infrastructure. So I'm wondering like, how do you see OTI's role in making this actionable?
So I'll take a first stab and then Tayeb, if you want to add on. So I think you're pointing out something that is largely often considered to be a characteristic of government, which is process. Everything is a sequence of steps in a process, and there are reviews, and there's like an order to do things. And obviously we've talked about that from the rules perspective and policy perspective, but that's the internal mechanics of government as well. I think what our focus is in the sort of, let's call it the medium term, is better understanding where those blocks are, because I think blocks we've seen occur in very different points. You're talking about something that I would say is quite early on, right? Like there's a blocker almost at the outset if you're not able to access the sorts of programs that you want to be able to do this work. We've seen other agencies who have talked about issues when they're actually a little bit farther along. You know, they've got something in hand, but then there's some sort of review or some sort of challenge that sort of is like, okay, brakes gets screeched, whatever, slammed on, I think was the word I was looking for. And then you like get stuck. So I don't want to sort of suggest there's like a magic wand that just makes process go away. I think government is very process driven by necessity. You know, it's often those processes are derived from mechanisms to ensure public accountability for resources and safety and risk. But I think what we want to be able to do is again, better understand the character of the sort of blocks that agencies are perceiving, and then work with partners within OTI to understand, is this a cybersecurity issue? Is there something with information privacy that needs to be unlocked here? Because the other dynamic is that some of those things are controls at the agency level, and then some of those things are controls at the citywide level, and even that is sometimes not always clear. So I think OTI is sort of readily, there to say, yeah, there's a lot of process, and think there's opportunity to make sure that user experience is better for agencies. But I think it's sort of a little bit context specific and depends on what specific issues agencies are seeing. We welcome any feedback that helps us collect data on that, right? So that if we know, hey, we have X number of agencies who are asking for this tool, which is how we actually get information, then that lets us know where the priorities are for what we need to be able to unlock next. And then we can sort of work with other partners to say, okay, like here's where people are stuck, and we need to come up with an answer. If we don't come up with an answer, more and more people are going to get stuck, and then people are going to be mad at us. OTI is a service agency, so our customers are other agencies. So if our agency customers aren't getting what they need, then we're not meeting our customer service goals.
Just quickly, I'm going to agree with all that here, and also say that my role and our role as ODA doesn't necessarily I think I would have other representatives to talk about what is going on with the city agency around that. I will say this, historically speaking, what this always kind of reminds me of is that, 10 years ago, the conversation around open source, a very similar, proposition. And there were your predecessors, in a room saying, what can we do to unlock open source? And, we're all kind of, and to some extent, it's sort of these kind of cyclical things where, on the one hand, I think there is genuine, kind of need to move cautiously for things. We're not just private entities here. A lot of us are kind of maintaining systems that have, require a great deal of public trust around them on that. So in any case, I can't give sort of a policy statement on that. Just to say that from, kind of an outside looking in, I said, this sounds like very much like, open source. And before that, I'm going to say internet, kind of even using like the internet and stuff. Can you believe it? And all for that, these kind of cautious approaches on that. But I think there's, a robust conversation at OTI, a robust conversation with CIOs at agencies that are beginning kind of to parse out what this means and what that could look like. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We're nearly out of time, so I'm going to give the panelists like a rapid fire question to kind of close us out. Maybe starting with Ariel, we'll go backwards. In one sentence, what is the single most important thing that you think the new administration could do in its first year on AI?
Utilizing trustworthy design patterns for AI and empowering their workforce with these tools.
Love that.
Think what she said. No, I'm going to say really again, going back 10 years, maybe more ago, this thing called human-centered design came about, and it was laughable. It was laughable. It was laughable in its early years,
Converted him.
Yeah. And people said, what is this about? And now everybody talks about we've been doing it for years and years. And so I think likewise, it's kind of bringing that, bringing this and bringing the public and bringing government kind of together to the fore is really critical on this issue.
I'd say let the problem drive the solution and focus on where technology is needed to help solve that problem versus a sort of end in and of itself. And that's where I think, what Taya mentioned earlier about data governance comes into play, because when you define the problem and you sort of say, okay, here's what we're trying to solve, you tackle some of those components of what you need to tackle before you have an effective AI solution first.
Agreed. Thank you all so much. These folks are experts, civil servants, current and former, and advocates for doing this well for all of our benefit. So please, let's give them a round of applause. Thank you so much.